Rose Claire Denton was 4 years old, barefoot, hungry, standing on a rough wooden platform in the middle of a town square while strangers looked her over and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. This was the third time they had brought her here. The third time she had stood on this platform in the summer heat while an auctioneer called out her details like she was a piece of equipment up for sale. The third time the crowd had looked and shrugged and turned away. She already knew how this went. She had stopped expecting it to go differently. She didn't cry. She didn't look at the faces watching her. She didn't fidget or reach for anyone or make a single sound. She just stood there, small and very still, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere far beyond the crowd, somewhere beyond the square, somewhere that wasn't here. She had learned to go there. To that faraway place inside herself where none of what was happening on the outside could touch her. Rose had gotten very good at going there. She was 4 years old, and that was already one of the most important skills she had. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of place she had been living in. It was the summer of 1889. The place was Harlan's Crossing, Wyoming territory. Every few months, the county held what they called a placement day. Children from the local children's facility were brought out to the town square, and the townspeople came, and the auctioneer called out each child's details the way a man calls out livestock at a county fair: age, condition, whether they were quiet or difficult, whether they'd be useful in a few years or whether they needed too much work before they were worth anything. Most children found someone willing to take them. The ones that didn't went back to the facility. Rose had been to 2 of these placements before this one. She had stood on this same platform twice already. Watched the auctioneer read from his ledger twice already. Stood in the heat while the crowd looked her over and decided she wasn't what they needed and walked away. She had stopped expecting today to be different. In the ledger, her name was Lot 14. She had a real name. Her parents had given it to her before the fever took them both, before the strangers came, before the facility, before all of it. But nobody at the facility used her name much. In the records, she was a case number. In the administrator's reports, she was a placement file. In the mouths of the people who had come to this square today, she was simply a child who was probably not worth the trouble. Her feet were burning on the hot wooden planks of the platform. She was hungry. The facility hadn't fed her that morning. The administrator, a thin, careful man named Wicks, had explained that it was impractical to feed children before a placement. The new family would want to set their own feeding schedule, and there was no sense wasting the facility's resources on a child who would be someone else's responsibility by noon. That was the word they used for the children: resources. Lot 14, the auctioneer called out, female child, approximately 4 years of age, quiet disposition, no apparent defects, physically sound. A woman near the front of the crowd looked Rose over the way you look at a tool you're not sure will hold up under real use. Quiet, the woman said. She hasn't moved in an hour. Something's off with her. She's simple. A man called from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. Wicks stepped forward with his clipboard and spoke in the careful, measured tone of a man reading from a document he had written himself and was proud of. Child is physically sound. Examined by our physician. She simply refuses to engage verbally. With appropriate discipline and consistent guidance, she would be suitable for light household work within 2 to 3 years. 2 to 3 years, the woman in front shook her head. I need help now, not a project. Do I have 50 cents to open? The auctioneer called. Anyone? 50 cents. Silence. 25. More silence. 2 men near the back exchanged a look and shrugged. A woman with a baby on her hip stopped paying attention and started looking down the street. A few more people drifted away. Cents, the auctioneer tried. Surely someone, look, said a large rancher near the back loud enough for everyone to hear. I came here for workers, able-bodied workers. That child will eat more than she produces for the next 3 years. I didn't come here for charity. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. The easy, thoughtless kind that doesn't stop to ask what exactly it's laughing at. Rose did not react. She had stopped reacting a long time ago. Reactions brought attention. Attention brought consequences. She stayed where she was, hands at her sides, feet burning on the boards, eyes at that far-off point, and she waited. She had been waiting for a long time. The auctioneer looked at Wicks. Wicks gave a small, tight nod. The gavel went up. Narrator beat. Hold here. Full pause. Let the silence work. Going once. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story is already reaching you, hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this travels. Going twice, hold that. The voice came from the edge of the square, not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the way certain voices carry, not through volume but through a certainty so complete that the noise around it simply stopped to make room. I said, hold that. Crowd turned. A man stood at the far edge of the gathering, one boot resting on the base of a water trough, arms folded across his chest. Tall, broad through the shoulders the way men get after decades of hard physical work, dark coat worn at the elbows, dark hair gone silver at the temples, a face that sun and wind and years of outdoor life had carved into something strong and private, the face of a man who had long ago decided that keeping his thoughts to himself was simply easier. Gray eyes, fixed on Rose. The crowd parted as he moved through it, not from fear, but from the instinctive recognition of something solid and immovable, the way water moves around a stone without being asked. His name was Garrett Cole. Most people in Harlan's Crossing knew that name. He owned Cole Ranch, one of the largest cattle operations in 3 counties, known to be fair, known to be honest, known to be the kind of man you did not approach with small talk or empty conversation. He had been a widower for 6 years, his wife and their unborn child lost to fever, and in the years since he had built his life into something quietly self-contained. A life designed not to need anything it didn't already have and not to offer anything it couldn't afford to lose. He had come to town that morning to settle a feed debt. He had planned to be gone before noon. He had heard the auctioneer's voice from half a block away and told his feet to keep moving. They had brought him here instead. Now he stood in front of the platform looking up at Rose. She still didn't look at him. Her eyes were still at that far point, still in that place inside herself where none of this could reach her, but something had shifted the moment his voice cut through the noise of the square. Something too small to name. The most cautious, tentative lowering of one wall among the many she had built. She hadn't looked at him, but she was listening. For the first time in longer than she could remember, some small part of her was waiting to hear what came next. Much? Garrett asked. The auctioneer's face moved through surprise and confusion and landed on the particular brightness of a man who smells money. Mr. Cole, for a man of your standing, I'm sure we can come to a very fair arrangement. How much? Garrett said again. Not a question the second time. Wick stepped forward and cleared his throat. The facility asks only that the child be placed in a home capable of meeting her basic needs. Given the county's considerable investment in her care, he paused, building to the number. We suggest a placement fee of $5. Several people nearby drew breath. $5 was a month's groceries for most families in Harlan's Crossing. It was a calculated number, designed to sound reasonable while ensuring the transaction felt significant enough to discourage impulse and stick to people who meant it. Garrett reached into his coat without a word, pulled out a worn leather wallet, counted out $5 silver and held them up in the afternoon light. Done. Auctioneer practically descended the steps to collect them. Wicks already had the paperwork laid out on his small table with the efficiency of a man who had been quietly hopping for exactly this outcome. If you'll just sign here, Mr. Cole, acknowledging receipt of the child and accepting full legal and financial responsibility for her care and conduct. Garrett signed without reading it. Sold, the auctioneer announced, his enthusiasm fully recovered. To Mr. Garrett Cole of Cole Ranch, a fine act of Christian charity, sir, truly. It's not charity, Garrett said quietly. He was not looking at the auctioneer. He was not looking at Wicks or the crowd or any of the faces that had just spent 20 minutes deciding this child was not worth 10 cents. He was looking at Rose. She still had not moved, still had not looked at him. She stood exactly as she had been standing since they brought her out, hands at her sides, feet on the hot boards, eyes somewhere else entirely. He approached the platform the way he would approach a spooked horse. Slowly, no sudden movements, no reaching. Just presence and patience and letting her track him if she needed to track him. When he reached her, he didn't lift her immediately. He crouched down, bringing himself close to her eye level. He waited until he was sure she had registered him, not her eyes, those were still somewhere far away, but the slight shift in her breathing, the way her shoulders moved almost imperceptibly in his direction. "Rose," he said, low and even. "That's your name, Rose Claire." "Nothing, Garrett Cole. I'm going to take you to my ranch. It's about 3 hours from here by wagon. I'm going to pick you up now and carry you to the wagon. I won't hurt you." Still nothing. He had not expected anything. He reached up and lifted her from the platform. She weighed almost nothing. Lifting her felt like lifting something assembled from paper and thin wire, all structure, no substance. The moment his arms came around her, her entire body went rigid. Not fighting, not reaching. Just locked, every muscle sealed against contact. The defensive stillness of something that has learned that going limp gets you dropped and fighting gets you punished, and the only option left is to endure without giving anything away. He carried her through the dispersing crowd to his wagon. He had cleared a space in the wagon bed and padded it with the canvas cover from one of the morning's supply loads. He set her down carefully. She sat exactly where he placed her, hands folded in her lap. Eyes resuming their distant focus, as though none of what had just happened had anything to do with her. "You can sit or lie down," he told her, "whichever you want." He set a canteen within easy reach of her hands. "If you need to stop for any reason on the road, you let me know. We'll stop." He climbed up onto the driver's seat, clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon rolled out of Harlan's crossing and onto the open road, leaving the square and the platform and the crowd and the ledger with its lot numbers behind. For the first 20 minutes Garrett did not look back. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, the dirt track winding through grasslands going golden in the summer heat, the mountains hazy and blue in the distance, the sky enormous and completely indifferent above it all. He had always understood open sky better than enclosed spaces. He had always understood animals better than people. He was attempting now to extend that understanding to the small, silent person in the back of his wagon, and finding it more difficult than he had anticipated. He had not planned this. That was the plain truth of it, and he was going to have to sit with it for 3 hours. He had walked into that square this morning as a man who had spent 6 years very carefully arranging his life to contain nothing that could be taken from him. His wife Ruth had been taken. Their unborn child had been taken. Fever had done it in the space of 2 weeks and left him standing in a house that suddenly had too many rooms and too much quiet. And he had spent the years since filling that quiet with work and building walls high enough that nothing could get back in to repeat the process. And then he had heard a crowd laugh at a child on an auction block, and something had cracked. Not sentimentality. He was not a sentimental man. What he had felt in that moment was something older and more specific than sentiment, the recognition of something he had seen before in animals pushed past the point of endurance, that particular hollow stillness, that complete inward withdrawal. He knew what it meant, and he knew what happened to creatures that reached that point and were not pulled back from it. He had not been able to walk away from it. That was the whole of it. No grand reasoning, no noble intention. He simply had not been able to make his feet carry him past that square. He pulled back on the reins, adjusted the horses around a rut in the road, and glanced over his shoulder. Rose sat exactly as he had placed her, hands folded, eyes at their far point, the canteen untouched beside her. "You can drink if you're thirsty," he said. "It's clean water." Nothing. He turned back to the road. He thought about what waited for him at the ranch, the work he had planned for the afternoon, the fence line on the east pasture that needed attention, the mare close to foaling that Hutty had been watching. He thought about the spare room upstairs that had been empty since he built the house, the one with the window that looked out over the valley. He thought about a child who weighed nothing and had gone rigid in his arms and had not made a single sound. This was going to be harder than breaking a wild horse, he thought. At least horses eventually showed you something, some flicker of what was underneath, some reaction, even a bad one, that told you there was still something there to reach. He wasn't sure yet what was underneath Rose's stillness. He wasn't sure she was either. If you're still with me right now, you already know this story is different. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what happens when they arrive at that ranch, I need you to be ready for it. Cole Ranch came into view as the afternoon sun began its descent, thousands of acres of grazing land spread across the valley floor. The main house built from good timber and stone, solid and settled, the kind of building that had been there long enough to stop trying to prove anything. A large barn, several outbuildings, corrals with good fencing, and in the far distance, cattle moving slowly through the grasslands like dark stones drifting in a slow current. It was a beautiful place. It was also a quiet one, and Garrett had made it that way deliberately. After Ruth died, he had poured himself into the ranch the way some men pour themselves into drinking, completely, methodically, with the specific intention of leaving no room for anything else. He had filled his days with work from before dawn until after dark. He had reduced his social obligations to the bare minimum that business required. He had created piece by deliberate piece, a life that fit him like a hand fits a worn glove, shaped exactly to what he was, requiring nothing he wasn't willing to give. He had told himself, often enough and convincingly enough, that this was what he wanted. Hattie Oakes was standing on the front porch when the wagon came up the road. Hattie had been the ranch's housekeeper for 4 years. She was a stout woman in her late 50s, built out of practical materials and assembled for longevity, steady, unsentimental, the kind of woman who had seen hard things and kept moving because stopping to feel them was a luxury the work didn't allow. She was a widow herself. She had come to work for Garrett after her own children were raised and gone, and she had adapted to his long silences and his preference for solitude with the pragmatic acceptance of a woman who had learned not to spend energy on things that were not going to change. She looked at the wagon coming up the road. She looked at Garrett on the driver's seat. She looked at the small figure sitting in the wagon bed. She came down the porch steps. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, approaching the way you approach something that needs handling before it needs explaining. "That appears to be a child. The back of your wagon. She's there because placement auction in town. She had nowhere else to go." Hattie moved to the wagon side and looked in. Rose sat unmoved, hands folded, eyes distant, the quality of her stillness up close even more striking than it had been from a distance. The sharpness of her collarbones under the ill-fitting dress. The old marks on her arms that even a quick glance read as something more than childhood clumsiness. The particular way she held herself, braced and inward, like something that has learned that the space it takes up is already too much. Hattie went very quiet. Then she looked up at Garrett and something moved through her face, something fierce and private that she ordered back quickly into the brisk efficiency the moment called for. "Well," she said, "get her inside. She looks half-starved and those feet have been on hot wood long enough." Hattie set a bowl of warm chicken broth and a thick piece of buttered bread in front of Rose without ceremony or softness or any of the cooing that adults sometimes deploy at frightened children and that frightened children almost universally distrust. She set it down. She stepped back. "That's yours," she said, plain and simple. "Eat as much or as little as you like. Nobody is going to take it away from you." Rose looked at the bowl. She looked at the bread. She looked at the spoon laid neatly beside the bowl. She looked at Hattie's face, then at Garrett's, checking for the catch, for the condition that food always came attached to in her experience, the thing you had to do or be or agree to before you were allowed to eat. She did not pick up the spoon. After a long moment she reached into the bowl with her fingers. She lifted a small piece of chicken, brought it to her mouth, chewed it with the mechanical focus of someone taking in fuel rather than food. And then with her other hand, so quietly and carefully that if you hadn't been watching for it you would have missed it entirely, she slipped a piece of bread into the fold of her dress. Garrett started to speak. Hattie's hand came down on his forearm, firm, silent. "Not yet." Rose looked up, a quick, sharp check to see if she'd been caught, if the consequence was coming. When neither adult moved or spoke, she went back to the bowl. "Eat, tuck away. Eat, tuck away." Working through the broth with quiet, practiced efficiency, her eyes moving between the food and their faces in a steady rotation that was not curiosity but survival calculation. When the broth was gone and her dress pockets were full of damp bread, she placed her hands back in her lap and went still again, as though the entire effort had used up the last of whatever she'd had left. Hattie cleared the bowl without a word. In the back hallway, she turned to Garrett with eyes that were doing the work of staying dry. She's been really hungry before, Hattie said quietly. The kind of hungry that teaches you not to trust that the next meal is coming. She'll keep doing that until she believes us that there will always be more. How long does that take? Garrett asked. Hattie looked at him steadily. As long as it takes. You don't rush it. You just keep feeding her and you don't comment on what she saves, and eventually one day she stops saving because she doesn't need to anymore. Garrett nodded. That child needs more than food, Hattie said. But food is where you start. Food is where you always start. On the third day, Garrett sent for Dr. Reeves. The doctor arrived mid-morning, a white-haired, practical man in his 60s who had been delivering bobbies and setting bones in Harlan's Crossing for 3 decades and had run out of illusions about most things a long time ago. He was prepared for a difficult examination. He encountered the difficulty immediately. The moment he set his black medical bag on the kitchen table and opened it, Rose went rigid in her chair. When he stepped toward her gently, slowly, announcing every movement in a low, calm voice, she jerked away with a violence that sent the chair scraping back across the floor. Her breathing went fast and shallow. Her eyes went wide. And what was in them was not her usual blankness. It was terror. Pure and complete and deeply practiced, the kind of terror that has been present for so long it has worn grooves. Easy now, Dr. Reeves said softly. I'm only going to stop. Garrett's voice was flat and quiet. Step back. Doctor stepped back. Garrett crossed to Rose and crouched beside her chair, getting himself below her eye level. He waited. He let her breathing find him, let her eyes locate him and stay. Rose, Dr. Reeves helps people when they're hurt or sick. That's all he does. But he is not going to touch you if you don't want him to. That is your choice entirely. He kept his voice the same steady register he used with spooked horses, not soft exactly, just even, reliable. Here is what is going to happen. He is going to sit at the far end of this table. He will not come any closer than that. He is going to ask you some questions. You don't have to answer any of them. Then he is going to look at you, only look, not touch, and make sure you are not hurt somewhere that needs attention. And if at any point you want him to leave this room, you stand up and walk out and nobody will stop you. Do you understand what I'm saying? The wild panic in her eyes had not disappeared, but it had dimmed. Dr. Reeves moved to the far end of the table without being asked again. He set his bag on the floor. He sat down and put both hands flat on the table where Rose could see them. Hello, Rose, he said. I've been a doctor for almost 30 years. People only ever see me when something needs to get better. That's the only reason I come into a room. He paused. Can you tell me if anything hurts right now? Silence. That's fine. If something does hurt, can you point to where? A long stillness. Then Rose's hand moved slowly. She touched her own stomach. The doctor's expression softened around the eyes. Your stomach, does it hurt all the time or just sometimes? She held up one finger, then two. Sometimes. Does it happen after you eat? A nod. Small. Deliberate. The first purposeful communication she had made since arriving at the ranch. Hattie made a sound behind them that she quickly converted into clearing her throat. Garrett felt something ease in his chest, not relief, not yet, but the first dim outline of what relief might eventually feel like. The examination continued that way for nearly an hour. The doctor never moved from his end of the table. He asked Rose to show him her hands, her arms, her feet. Just show, not offer, not allow contact. He recorded everything in his notebook with quiet efficiency and kept his face neutral until the examination was done, and he and Garrett were standing in the front hallway alone. Then his face was not neutral. Malnourished, he said. Significantly. The bruising on her arms and legs is not from falls or accidents. The pattern and the staging indicate repeated handling over time. Her feet show evidence of prolonged exposure to rough surfaces without adequate protection. He paused. The stomach pain will resolve with regular feeding. What concerns me most is not any of that. What concerns you most? Garrett asked. Her mind, the dissociation, the hoarding, the complete verbal shutdown, the way she responded to my bag just now. He looked at Garrett directly. Those are not personality traits. Those are what a child's mind does when it has lived in sustained fear for long enough that it has stopped believing safety is possible. Her body is repairable. The question is whether her mind will follow. Some children recover fully, Dr. Reeves said. Some partially. A few don't recover at all. The damage is too early and too deep. I cannot tell you which she will be. What I can tell you is that the only conditions under which recovery is possible at all are time, complete safety, and absolute consistency. The same people, the same place, the same responses every single day without exception. No surprises, no broken promises, no conditions placed on the safety. He picked up his bag. If you can give her that, she has a genuine chance. If she is moved again to another home, another facility, anywhere, the prognosis becomes considerably worse. He paused at the door. Whatever happened to her before she came here, it happened for a long time. Don't expect this to move quickly, and do not let anyone take her away from this place. It was on the 10th day that something shifted. Garrett was in the barn with the mare close to foaling, speaking to her in the low, unhurried voice he used with nervous animals. Not so much words as sound. A continuous steady presence that said, I am here, and I am not leaving, and everything happening right now is going to be all right. He had been in the barn for over an hour. The mare was restless, packing, uncomfortable with the specific discomfort of labor that is new and uncharted. He didn't hear the footsteps. He turned from the stall and nearly walked directly into Rose. She was standing just inside the barn door, still in the shadow near the entrance. She had not made a sound. He had no idea how long she had been there. She had never come outside before. In 10 days at the ranch, she had not left the house. Rose, he said, keeping his voice exactly as it had been, low and even and without surprise. You came out. That's all right. You can come in if you want. She didn't move closer, but she didn't leave. Her eyes were on the mare, and the quality of her attention was entirely different from her usual blankness. This was focus, real and present focus. The mare shifted and tossed her head, and Rose's gaze tracked the movement with something that looked, cautiously, tentatively, like genuine interest. This is Juniper, Garrett said. He moved back from the center of the barn, creating open space between Rose and the exit, making sure she could see her own way out from where she stood. She's going to have a foal soon, a baby horse. She's nervous because she hasn't done this before. She doesn't know yet that it's going to be all right. Mare made a low sound. Rose's eyes widened slightly. She's not in serious pain, Garrett said. Just uncomfortable, like a bad stomachache with something good waiting at the end of it. He kept working. Kept talking, partly to the mare and partly to Rose, explaining what he was doing and why, the same way he always talked through his work when he was alone in the barn. He filled the air with quiet information and left the rest of the space open, and did not look at Rose directly or ask her for anything or make any movement toward her. She stayed for over an hour. When he finally walked back toward the house for supper, she followed him. Not beside him, at a distance of about 8 feet, not quite looking at him, positioned slightly to his left. A shadow that had made the quiet decision that following might be safer than staying behind. Hattie saw them come in from the kitchen window. She said nothing until after supper when Rose had gone upstairs. She followed you, Hattie said. A ways back. Still followed you. Garrett was quiet for a moment. She's curious about the horse. She's curious about you, Hattie said. The horse is just the safe way to show it. What happens next in this barn, the moment that changed everything between them, I need you to stay with me. And if someone you know needs to hear a story like this today, share this right now. Let's see how far it goes. 3 days later, Juniper foaled. Garrett brought Rose to the barn for it, not by asking, not by leading, just by going out himself and leaving the door open behind him. And she came the way she always came now, at her distance, in her own time, settling herself outside the stall with her back against the wall and her arms around her knees. He talked her through every stage, what the sounds meant, what was happening inside the mare's body and why, what the foal would do when it arrived. He kept the same voice he always used, steady and matter-of-fact, like explaining anything else. Fence work, weather signs, the behavior of cattle in summer heat, just information, just presence. When the foal finally came, wet and spindly and deeply confused by the concept of existing, Rose exhaled. One long, slow breath, like something that had been held for a long time, releasing. Garrett looked at her. Her eyes were enormous. Something lived in them that he had not seen there before. Not blankness. Not fear. Not the mechanical endurance she wore like a second skin. something lit from a place deeper than all of that, wonder, pure and completely unguarded. The way children are supposed to look at things before the world teaches them to be careful about looking. When the foal pulled itself upright on trembling, uncertain legs, Rose made a sound, barely a sound, more like a breath that shaped itself almost into a word before losing confidence. "You want to help me name him?" Garrett asked. She looked at the foal, she looked at Garrett. She worked at something internally, laboring over it. "Bright," she said, barely a whisper. The word came out soft and uncertain, like something that had been indoors too long and wasn't sure yet about the light. He kept his face still. He did not make a production of it. He did not exclaim or react or let her see how much that one word cost him to receive calmly. "Bright," he said. "Is that what you're thinking?" A definite nod. "That's a strong name." "He looks like a Bright." He stood and brushed hay from his trousers. "Come on, let's leave them to rest." As they crossed the yard back toward the house side by side for the first time, not 8 feet apart, Rose's hand found his. Just for a moment. Just the briefest press of small fingers against his palm there and gone before it fully registered, as though she'd reached out and then thought better of it and pulled back before the world could notice what she'd done. Garrett kept walking, kept his breathing even. Did not squeeze back, did not comment, did not do anything at all that would make her aware of what had just happened. But that night he sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone dark, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, and he thought about 5 small fingers against his palm for 3 seconds on a Thursday evening in October. He thought about it for a long time. "I need you to hit that like button right now. Because what comes next, the moment real danger arrives at that ranch, is something I have never seen in any story. You need to be here for it." 3 weeks after the placement, 2 riders came up the ranch road on a Tuesday morning. Garrett was in the front yard with Rose. He had been showing her how to hold a fence tool, not because the work required her involvement, but because for the past week her hands had been edging toward his tools with the careful, sideways interest of a child who wants to participate but isn't certain permission exists. He had simply handed her one and shown her what it was for, and she had been holding it with great seriousness for the better part of 20 minutes, turning it over, examining it, occasionally glancing at him to confirm she was still allowed to have it. When the horses came through the gate, Rose looked up. The moment she registered the strangers, a man with a sheriff's star and a woman in town clothes carrying a leather case, her body did the thing it did. The fence tool hit the ground. She was gone before Garrett had fully processed that she was moving, fast and completely silent, disappearing into the dark mouth of the open barn door like a small animal that has learned exactly how quickly danger can close the distance. Garrett picked up the fence tool, set it on the post, walked out to meet the visitors. Sheriff Dunmore dismounted first. He was a decent man, honest, methodical, not imaginative, the kind of man who followed rules because following rules was the architecture of the world he understood, and he did not care to examine what happened when the architecture was wrong. "Mr. Cole, this is Miss Hartwell. She's with the County Child Welfare Board. She's here to conduct a formal welfare assessment on the child in your placement." Miss Hartwell was in her mid-40s, trim, composed. Sharp eyes that moved across the ranch the way an auditor's eyes move across a set of books, quickly, efficiently, already organizing what they saw into categories of adequate and inadequate. She carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who has spent a long time doing something they believe to be right and has arranged their world so that belief is rarely seriously challenged. "Mr. Cole," she said, with a brief professional nod. She was already writing in her leather journal. "I'll need to inspect the premises, review the child's living conditions, and observe her directly." "Ran when she saw you," Miss Hartwell noted, without looking up from her writing. That's a concerning response in a child who should be settled in her placement by now. A traumatized child was startled by unexpected strangers arriving without warning, Garrett said. His voice was even. "That is not a concerning response. That is an understandable one." Miss Hartwell's pen kept moving. The inspection took 2 hours. Miss Hartwell moved through the ranch house with systematic thoroughness, examining Rose's room, noting the sparse furnishings, the absence of toys, the plainness of the space. She questioned Hattie at length about meal schedules, bathing routines, sleeping patterns, educational activities, and the child's daily routine. She recorded all of it in her leather journal with the steady, satisfied scratching of a woman assembling something she intends to use. It took Garrett 20 minutes to coax Rose out of the barn. He found her in an empty stall, pressed into the far corner with her back against the boards, knees drawn up, the red bandana he had given her, an old soft one from his early ranching days that she had taken to carrying everywhere, knotted so tightly in both fists that her knuckles had gone the color of bone. He crouched at the entrance of the stall. Not inside. He didn't cross the threshold. Rose, those people outside are from the county. They want to make sure you are being taken care of properly. They are not here to take you away. He held her gaze. And I will not let them. But we need to go out there and show them that everything here is good. Can you do that for me? Just for a little while and then they will leave. She looked at him with the expression she always used when she was measuring the distance between what he said and what she had been taught to expect, checking for the gap, checking for the catch. He held her gaze and did not look away. She stood up slowly. She walked to him. She took his hand. Miss Hartwell's assessment of Rose was brief and clinical. She noted the continued nonverbal state, the flinching response to proximity, the absence of peer socialization. She asked Rose 3 questions and received no verbal answers to any of them. She wrote that down. Child shows no meaningful improvement in her communication, she said afterward, standing in the kitchen with her journal open. Environment is isolated. No other children present. No formal education structure. No maternal figure of any kind. The placement guardian is an unmarried man with no prior experience of child-rearing, living in deliberate social isolation. She closed the journal with a precise snap. I will be filing a report recommending formal review of this placement. The board will make its determination within 30 days. After they left, Garrett found Rose exactly where he expected to find her. Back in the empty stall, back against the boards, knees up, the bandana in her hands again, he sat down on the floor of the stall beside her, not touching her, just there for a while. Neither of them said anything. The barn settled around them, the sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the low wind moving through the gaps in the boards, the distant sound of cattle. Not going anywhere, Garrett said, quiet and flat and certain as anything he had ever said in his life. I don't care what that woman writes in her report or what the board decides they think. This is your home, and I am going to fight to keep it that way. That is a promise. Rose turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were full of fear and full of questions and full of something else underneath both of those things, something exhausted and paper-thin and barely still standing that was nonetheless still there. A hope that had survived everything thrown at it and somehow had not yet gone out entirely. She looked at him with that hope like it was the most dangerous thing she owned, and she held on to it anyway. That same night, after the house had gone dark and quiet, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with a pocket knife and a small block of cedar. He had been working on it every evening for the past week after Rose went to bed. He was not a craftsman. He was a rancher. The legs were slightly uneven, and the mane was more suggested than sculpted, and no one looking at it would mistake it for professional work. But it was unmistakably a horse, small enough to sit in a child's palm. And it had been made with care, the particular kind of care that is not about skill but about intention, about the specific attention you give to something when the person you are making it for matters to you. In the morning he set it on the parlor floor within Rose's reach. He did not make a presentation of it. He did not call her over or stand and watch. He just set it down. That's for you, he said. Something to hold on to when things feel bad. Rose approached it slowly. She crouched down and picked it up with both hands. She turned it over, studying every side with the gravity and thoroughness of a child conducting a formal assessment. She looked at the legs. She looked at the rough mane. She held it up toward the window and examined it against the light. Then she pressed it against her chest. She closed her eyes. Her arms came up around it, holding it the way you hold something you are afraid might be taken back if you are not careful enough about keeping it. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he walked out to the barn, because there was work to be done, and because the alternative was standing in his own parlor feeling something he was not yet ready to put a name to. If this story is doing something to you right now, I want you to comment one word below. Just one word describing how you feel in this moment. I want to see every single one. Formal notice arrived on a cold morning in late October. A young deputy delivered it. He handed it to Garrett at the front door and would not meet his eyes the entire time and left quickly, the way people leave when they are doing something that feels wrong but has been framed to them as procedure. The County Child Welfare Board was convening a formal custody hearing to determine whether Rose Claire Denton should remain in the care of Garrett Cole or be removed to a more appropriate placement. Hearing date, October 28th. 3 weeks away. Garrett read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, picked it up, read it a third time. Hattie came in from the hallway, picked it up without asking, read it, set it back down. They are really doing this, she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who has just had a thing she feared confirmed. Yes, they cannot just, they believe they can. Rose was at the kitchen table when they came in, working on her letters. Hattie had started teaching her the alphabet 2 weeks ago using chalk and a small slate board, and Rose had taken to it with the quiet, focused intensity she brought to anything offered to her without conditions or expectations. She looked up when they entered the kitchen. Something in Garrett's face changed hers. The careful openness that had been slowly building over the past weeks, the tiny softening around her eyes, the way she had started sitting differently at the table, less like someone bracing for what was coming next, began to close down. The old blankness gathered at the edges of her expression like weather. Garrett crossed to her immediately and crouched beside her chair. "Everything is all right," he said. "Nothing is changing today. I received a letter about some meetings I need to attend. Grown-up business. Boring." "Okay?" She looked at him for a long moment with that unnerving accuracy she had developed. The ability to read what lived underneath the surface of what was being said. Then her hand moved across the table and took hold of his sleeve. She held it. She did not let go. Attorney Price arrived that afternoon. He was young, recently arrived from back east, idealistic in the way of men who have not yet had enough of their idealism, removed by contact with how things actually work. Under different circumstances, Garrett might have found that quality irritating. Right now, he needed someone who still believed that losing battles were worth fighting, and Price had that quality in abundance. He spread documents across the dining room table and walked Garrett through the situation with methodical care while Hattie made coffee and Rose sat in the doorway of the room, watching, the carved horse in one hand. Placement was legal. The paperwork is filed and recorded. You are legally her guardian on those grounds. He paused. However, informal placements can be challenged if the board determines the environment is not in the child's best interest. Ms. Hartwell's report will carry considerable weight with Judge Aldrich. What does her report say specifically? That the placement is inappropriate, unmarried guardian, no maternal figure, isolated environment, no peer socialization, continued trauma symptoms with no demonstrable improvement. He hesitated. She has also identified 3 families willing to take Rose, all 2-parent households, church-going, established in the community. She will present them to the judge as superior alternatives. Garrett was very still for a moment. Where were those families, he said, on the day of the placement auction? Price met his eyes. They were not there. They were not. I know. But the board's argument will be that traditional family structure constitutes a better environment than financial resources and good intentions alone, regardless of what was happening 3 weeks ago. Price tapped his pen on the table. We counter with evidence. Dr. Reeves documenting her physical and psychological improvement. Hattie testifying to her daily progress. Character witnesses establishing your fitness as a guardian. He paused. And if Rose would be willing to speak at the hearing, even a few words, expressing that she wants to stay, it would carry more weight with the judge than anything else we could put before him. I will not force her, Garrett said. Not suggesting force. I'm suggesting you explain to her what is happening and give her the choice. She deserves to know, and if she decides she wants to speak, we should let her. That evening, Garrett found Rose in Bright's stall. The foal had grown considerably since his birth, less wobbly now, beginning to develop the first outlines of the horse he was going to become. Rose sat in the straw beside him with one hand resting on his nose, and Bright was accepting this with the easy tolerance of a young animal that has decided one particular human is simply part of the landscape of his life. Garrett sat down in the straw on her other side. For a while the three of them just existed together in the quiet of the barn, the shift and settle of horses in adjacent stalls, the low sound of wind outside, the last of the October light coming through the high barn windows at a long angle. Then Garrett spoke, choosing each word the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground, carefully, one at a time, testing before you commit your weight. Rose. There are some people who believe you would be better off living somewhere else, with a family that has a mother and a father, maybe other children to grow up alongside. Her whole body locked. She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has been waiting with the absolute bone-deep certainty of long experience for the betrayal that was always coming. She had been waiting for it since the first day. She had known it was there. She had been watching for it every single day and telling herself not to watch for it and watching for it anyway, and here it was. "I don't think that," he said immediately, holding her gaze. "I want you to stay here. I believe this is your home, and I believe that is true in every way that matters. But these people have the authority to overrule me if the judge decides to let them, so we have to convince him they are wrong." He waited, letting that settle. "There is going to be a meeting," he continued. "A formal meeting with a judge where people will speak about what they think is best for you. If you wanted to speak for yourself, to tell the judge that you want to stay here, that would help us more than anything else we could do. But only if you want to. You do not have to do anything you are not ready for. That choice is entirely yours. Do you understand what I'm saying?" She was shaking. It started in her hands and moved through her entire body in a slow wave. She came off the barn floor and pressed herself against him and grabbed his coat with both fists, and he put his arms around her and held on. "No matter what happens in that room," he said into her hair, "I am going to fight for you. I told you I keep my promises. I do. You are not going back to that facility. You are not going back to the dark room or anywhere like it. I will not let that happen. Do you hear me?" She didn't say anything, but she did not let go of his coat. And after a long time, very slowly, the shaking stopped. The nightmares had been coming back for 3 days. Every night since the summons arrived, Rose had woken in the small hours. Not crying out, never crying out. That was the thing that broke Garrett's heart most consistently about her, that she had learned to be afraid silently. And she would appear in his doorway with the carved horse and the red bandana in her hands and tears moving quietly down her face. And he would lift the blanket, and she would climb in, and he would hold on until the shaking stopped and sleep eventually took her back. The night before the hearing was the worst. She appeared at his door at 1:30 in the morning, shaking so hard he could see it from across the dark room. He didn't ask questions. He lifted the blanket. She crossed the room and climbed in and curled against his side, and he put his arm around her and felt the shaking work its way through her in long, slow waves. "In the dream," she whispered, when the shaking had eased enough for words, "they said the judge made a mistake. They came and said it was a mistake and I had to go back. That is not going to happen," he said. "The judge's ruling tomorrow is final and legal and permanent. Once it is written down, it cannot be undone. You will be mine in every way the law recognizes. Do you know what that means? It means even if someone wanted to separate us and they cannot, the law itself says you belong here, with me, in this house, on this ranch, forever. Promise," she said. "Never break my promises, Rose." She was quiet for a while. The shaking continued to ease gradually, the way a storm eases, not all at once but in stages. Worst of it passing, and then the aftermath passing, and then finally just the stillness on the other side. "What if I'm not brave enough?" she said. "Tomorrow, what if I can't do it?" "You don't have to do anything tomorrow that you don't choose to do," he said. "If you decide in that room that you don't want to speak, you stay beside me and you hold my hand and I will do the rest. And if you decide you do want to speak," he paused, "then you will be the bravest person in that building, and I will be right there." She was quiet again then. "Will you stay tonight?" "Yes," he said. "I'll stay." He stayed. He lay awake long after her breathing had evened into sleep, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the ranch settle around them, the sound of horses in the barn, the low moan of wind under the eaves, the tick and crack of old timber adjusting to the cold, He thought about Ruth, about the child they had lost before it had the chance to be born. About 6 years of building walls and maintaining them and telling himself the walls were what he wanted. He thought about 5 small fingers against his palm for 3 seconds on a Thursday in October. He thought about tomorrow. He was not afraid of the hearing. He was afraid of what it would do to Rose if it went wrong. That was the only fear he had left, and it was large enough to fill all the space the other fears had vacated. He lay in the dark and made silent promises to whatever was listening. Not this one, not her. She does not go back. The courthouse in Harlan's Crossing was built from gray stone and had been there longer than most of what surrounded it, heavy and permanent, and designed to communicate that certain things in this world were not subject to negotiation. By the time Garrett arrived with Rose and Hattie, a crowd had already gathered on the steps. Word had traveled, the way word travels in small towns, efficiently and with embellishment. People had come to see what would happen to the wealthy, reclusive rancher and the child nobody had wanted. The 3 prospective families were already inside. The Galbraiths, the Mertons, the Ashworths, well-dressed, composed, arranged in the front rows with the posture of people who have been told they are doing a good thing and have organized themselves accordingly. They looked warm. They looked stable. They looked like everything Miss Hartwell's report said Rose needed. Rose looked at them once and then looked at the floor and took Garrett's hand and did not look at them again. Judge Aldrich was already seated when they entered. He was in his late 60s, precise and spare, with the air of a man who had heard every possible argument the world had to offer and had developed strong opinions about which ones deserved his time. He called the hearing to order without preamble. Miss Hartwell presented first. She was thorough and composed and entirely genuine in her belief that she was right, which made her, in certain ways, more formidable than an opponent who was simply cynical. She built her case methodically. The isolation of the ranch, the single male guardian, the absence of maternal influence, the child's continued trauma symptoms, the superior alternatives represented by the 3 families in the front rows. She spoke about Rose's best interests with the fluency of someone who had spent considerable time constructing this argument, and not enough time questioning whether its foundations were sound. Attorney Price responded. Dr. Reeves took the stand. He documented Rose's physical recovery in precise medical language, her weight on arrival against her weight now, the healing of old injuries, the resolution of the stomach pain, the reduction in dissociative episodes. He was asked directly whether this placement had been beneficial or harmful to the child. Beneficial, he said, without hesitation or qualification. This child was in critical psychological and physical distress when she arrived at Cole Ranch. She is now recovering. The trajectory is clear and it is positive. The question before this court is not whether she is fully healed. 2 months is not enough time for that, and anyone who tells you otherwise does not understand trauma. The question is whether she is moving in the right direction. She is, unambiguously and measurably. Hattie testified next, and she was not a woman who could be rattled by a county lawyer asking pointed questions. She had raised 4 children and buried a husband and worked hard every day of her adult life, and she sat in that chair and described Rose's daily reality at Cole Ranch with the authority of a woman who had lived every minute of it. She described the first meal, the hoarding. The first time Rose had willingly handed Garrett a tool. The first word. The morning after Bright was born, when Rose had come downstairs and eaten her entire breakfast without saving a single piece of it, and neither of them had said a word about it, and Hattie had gone into the pantry afterward and cried quietly into a dish towel for 5 minutes. That man, she said, and she pointed at Garrett with the directness of a woman who has no patience for indirection, has given that little girl the one thing she has never had and the one thing she cannot heal without. Safety that does not have conditions on it. Safety that is simply there every day regardless of whether she has earned it or deserved it or been good enough for it. Because of that, only because of that, she is beginning to heal. You remove her from it and I cannot tell you what will be left of her. But I know it will be less than what is sitting in this room today. The county's witnesses came and went. a minister who spoke about maternal guidance and the importance of religious instruction, a teacher who had never met Rose but had strong opinions about peer socialization. Mrs. Galbraith, who described her warm household and her children's excitement at the prospect of a little sister, and who seemed, Garrett thought, genuinely kind, and genuinely absent from the town square on the day Rose had stood on a platform and nobody bid. The hearing went on for hours. The afternoon light through the courthouse windows moved from bright to gold to the early gray of late afternoon. Judge Aldrich listened to all of it. He took notes. He asked occasional precise questions. His face gave nothing away. Then he set down his pen. "I would like to hear from the child." Room went quiet in the complete and immediate way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected and significant has been said. "Your Honor," Price was on his feet immediately, measured but careful. "The child is 4 years old and has experienced severe and prolonged psychological trauma. We are not certain that placing her in this position is—" "I understand your concern, Mr. Price." Judge Aldrich's voice was not unkind. "But this hearing exists to determine what is best for this child. I believe she is entitled to have a voice in that determination if she is willing and able to offer one. I will not push her. But I would like to give her the opportunity." Garrett felt Rose go rigid against his side. Her breathing shifted shallower, faster, the pattern he knew from her worst nights, the pattern that meant the fear had moved from manageable to immediate. He leaned close to her ear. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly. "I can tell the judge right now that you don't want to and he will move on. It is your choice. It has always been your choice." Rose looked at him, then she looked at the judge. Then at the Galbraith family in the front row, warm-faced, kind-eyed, arranged into a picture of everything a child was supposed to need. Her hand found his and held it so hard he felt her fingernails in his palm. Then she slid off her chair. The courtroom held its breath. She walked forward, this small girl in her blue calico dress with the white flower print and the ribbon in her braided hair, the carved horse held against her chest in one hand, and she crossed the floor of that stone courthouse and stopped in front of the judge's bench and looked up. She was shaking visibly. Her whole body was trembling, but she was standing. Judge Aldrich leaned forward slightly. His voice, when he spoke to her, was different from the voice he had been using all afternoon. Quieter. More careful. "Hello, Rose. My name is Judge Aldrich. I'm trying to decide where you should live so that you will be safe. Do you understand what I do?" A nod. "You like living with Mr. Cole?" Another nod. Emphatic. "Would you like to stay with him?" Emphatic again. No hesitation. "Can you tell me why?" "Use your words if you can, sweetheart. Take as much time as you need." Silence that followed was the longest silence Garrett had ever sat inside. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed to breathe. The only sound in that stone room was the faint creak of the building settling and the distant sound of wind outside. Then Rose's voice came, small, barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that room it carried to every corner. "He doesn't hurt me." Room did not make a sound. The kind of silence that falls when something true, something nakedly, undeniably true, has been spoken aloud in a space that was not expecting it. Judge Aldrich's expression shifted. Something in his eyes became very focused and very still. "No one should ever hurt you, Rose," he said quietly. "No one. Can you tell me anything else about Mr. Cole?" She was struggling, working at words with a vocabulary that was still new, still fragile, still not equal to everything she needed to say. Her face showed the effort of it. "He gave me Bright," she said. A pause. "He reads to me." Another pause, longer. "And when I'm scared," her voice caught, but she steadied herself against it, standing straighter. "He stays." The tears came then. Silent, the way her tears always were, moving down her face while her voice kept going. "Other place said nobody wanted me. They said I was broken. They said I was bad." She was trembling harder now, but she did not stop. "But she pointed at Garrett with one shaking hand. "He said I was his." She clutched the carved horse tighter. "I'm not going to the dark room. I'm not going back there." Miss Hartwell began to rise. "Sit down." Judge Aldrich did not raise his voice. Miss Hartwell sat down. He kept his eyes on Rose. "Rose," he said, very gently, "what is the dark room?" Her face crumpled. "Where they put the bad children," she whispered. "Where nobody comes back from." Judge Aldrich sat back in his chair. The change in his expression was subtle but complete, a hardening around the jaw, a cooling in the eyes, the look of a man who has just made a decision that he will not be moved from. He looked at Miss Hartwell for a long time. She looked away first. Then he looked at Garrett. Mr. Cole, approach. Garrett stood. The moment he did, Rose was beside him, her hand in his, pressed against his leg. This child, the judge said, looking at both of them, is clearly and deeply attached to you, and clearly and deeply traumatized by wherever she was before. He turned to Price. Mr. Price, you mentioned earlier that you had documentation regarding conditions at the county children's facility. Affidavits, I believe. Your Honor, 2 sworn affidavits from former residents. I had not planned to introduce them unless the testimony made it necessary. Is necessary. Introduce them. The affidavits were read into the record. They were not dramatic documents. They were plain and specific, written by people who had learned that precision was the only defense available to those whom no one believes, and that plain facts stated clearly are harder to dismiss than emotion. The first described the quiet room in detail. What it was, how it was used, how long children were kept there and for what offenses, crying too much, asking for food outside of scheduled meal times, attempting to leave, refusing to comply with correction, speaking back. The first affidavit was from a man who had been at the facility as a boy and had been in the quiet room 6 times before he aged out at 16. He described what 6 days in total darkness does to a child. He described what it feels like to be told, repeatedly and with complete institutional authority, that your pain is a behavior problem. The second affidavit was from a young woman named Sarah Brennan, 20 years old. She had aged out of the system 2 years prior and had been contacted by Attorney Price 2 weeks ago and had agreed, without hesitation, to put her name to what she had witnessed. Her words were read aloud in the quiet of the stone courthouse. The facility operated on one principle. Children who caused no trouble were placed quickly. Children who caused trouble were broken until they caused no trouble. The quiet room was the primary instrument of that process. Director Baines believed that a child who had been in the dark long enough would come out cooperative. She was usually right. The ones who came out after multiple days were very quiet, very still, very easy to manage. They had learned that wanting things and showing it led to the dark, so they stopped showing it. Some of them stopped wanting things entirely. Those children frightened me more than any of the others, the ones who went completely still inside. I watched one little girl come out of that room after 3 days and I never saw her cry again. Not once. Not for anything. She had decided crying was not safe and she was 4 years old and she had decided that. The room was completely silent when the reading ended. Judge Aldrich looked at Miss Hartwell. You came into this courtroom today, he said, to advocate for returning this child to institutional care, or to the care of families who were not present when she needed someone to be present. His voice was measured and entirely cold. In light of what has just been entered into this record, what we now know about the conditions inside the institution under your board's oversight, do you still believe that removal from Mr. Cole's care is in this child's best interest? Miss Hartwell's jaw worked. Your Honor, I had no direct knowledge of the conditions described. That was not what I asked. Yes or no? A long silence. No, she said. The judge nodded once. He turned his gaze to the 3 families in the front rows. You are here, he said, because you believe you can provide this child with something better than what she currently has. I do not doubt that some of you are sincere in that belief, but I have a question for you. He looked at them steadily. Where were you on the morning of the placement auction, when this child stood on a platform in the summer heat and the crowd offered nothing for her? When the auctioneer was prepared to send her back to the institution that we have just heard described in sworn testimony, no one answered. The silence said everything. You were not there, the judge said. You are here now because a wealthy man stepped forward and the situation became a story worth paying attention to. Mr. Cole was there on the day when there was no story, when there was only a child and a crowd and the question of whether anyone was going to do the right thing. He turned to Garrett. Mr. Cole, I want to ask you something directly. Why did you stop that auction? Garrett looked down at Rose. She was pressed against his leg, her hand in his, her face turned up to him, the carved horse in her other hand. the red bandana tucked into her pocket, tear tracks drying on her face. Those blue eyes with all of their exhausted, impossible, surviving hope looking up at him and waiting. He could not account for what he said next. He had not planned it. He had not rehearsed it. He had spent 6 years building the walls that what he was about to say would knock down completely, and he opened his mouth and knocked them down without hesitating. Because nobody should be worth nothing, he said. She was alone and she was frightened and she was heading somewhere worse than where she had already been. I could not walk away from that and live with myself. Do you love her? The question landed in the room the way stones land in still water, complete, immediate, spreading outward. Garrett had not prepared for this question. It was the one question his walls had been specifically constructed to make unanswerable. 6 years of deliberate, careful, thorough construction, all of it aimed at ensuring that this question would never again apply to him. He looked at Rose. She was looking up at him, waiting, with the complete attention of a child who has learned to read people accurately because her survival has depended on it, and who is reading him now as carefully as she has ever read anything. He could not lie to her. He had never been able to lie to her. From the very first day he had known, somewhere below conscious thought, that lying to this child was not something he was capable of doing. Not because of principle, because of her, because of what she had already survived and what it had cost her, and what it meant that she was still here in front of him extending trust she had no logical reason to extend. Yes, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She is mine and I am hers. That is not going to change. It will not change for anything. Judge Aldrich picked up his gavel. He looked at Rose one more time, this small girl standing in a stone courthouse in her best dress, holding a rough-carved wooden horse against her chest, with tears drying on her face and her hand in the hand of the man who had stopped a clock for her on a Tuesday morning in August. I am ruling in favor of Mr. Cole, he said. The petition to remove Rose Claire Denton from his care is denied. Furthermore, effective immediately, I am formalizing this adoption and granting Mr. Cole full and permanent legal parental rights. This child is his in every sense of the word, and this ruling is final. Gavel came down. The sound of it echoed off the stone walls. Rose made a sound that was not crying and not laughing, and was both of those things at once. A sound that had never had occasion to come out of her before because the thing that produced it had never happened to her before, and she threw herself at Garrett. He caught her. He lifted her up. She locked her arms around his neck so hard he could not fully breathe, and he held on with everything he had and did not try to breathe. I'm also ordering an immediate formal investigation into the Harlan's Crossing Children's Facility, the judge continued, his voice carrying over the movement and sound beginning to fill the room. Sheriff Dunmore, I want Director Baines and her senior staff detained for questioning before the end of today, and I want the name and current location of every child who has passed through that facility in the past 5 years. Every one. Agnes was crying openly. Price looked stunned and triumphant. The 3 families filed quietly out of the front rows, some looking ashamed, some looking merely disappointed, none of them looking like people who had been present on the morning when presence had mattered. Miss Hartwell sat very still at her table. Garrett stood in the middle of it all, holding Rose, feeling her heartbeat against his chest and her arms locked around his neck, listening to her breathe. She was saying something into his shoulder. So quiet he almost missed it under the noise of the room. Don't let go. Please don't let go. Never, he said. His voice broke on the word and he let it break and did not try to stop it. I am never letting go. The ride back to Cole Ranch was quiet, but it was the first quiet in Rose's life that felt like something given rather than something imposed. Not the quiet of absence, not the quiet of a child who has learned to make herself small enough not to be noticed, not the held breath quiet of waiting for what comes next. This quiet was warm. This quiet had room in it. Rose sat pressed against Garrett's side on the driver's bench, not in the wagon bed, on the bench beside him, where she had climbed without being asked and without explanation, with her hand wound into the fabric of his coat. She was not bracing. She was not scanning the horizon for the next thing to survive. She was simply sitting beside the person she had decided to sit beside and watching the Wyoming Territory roll past in the long golden light of late afternoon. Hattie sat on her other side, one arm around Rose's shoulders, crying with the unself-conscious openness of a woman who has decided that this particular moment has fully earned it, and she will not apologize for her response to it. "It's over," Hattie kept saying softly, to no one in particular, to all of them, to the open sky. "It is really and truly over." Garrett drove and said nothing. He thought about the word the judge had used when he signed the final papers, father. He turned it over in his mind the way you turn over something you have found and are not sure yet what to do with. Father. He had been a husband once, briefly and completely, and at the cost of everything when it ended. He had been on his way to being a father once, and that had ended before it had the chance to begin. He had spent 6 years being neither of those things and telling himself that was fine, that was chosen, that was what he wanted, father. It sounded, he thought, like something that had always been true about him and had simply been waiting for the right circumstance to become visible. He had expected her to sleep well, the legal threat resolved, the worst behind them, the judge's ruling written down and permanent and beyond challenge. He had put her to bed that night in her room with the window that looked out over the valley, and she had been quiet and still in the particular way that is peace rather than armor. And he had thought she would sleep the long, deep sleep of a child who has finally set down something heavy. Instead, at 1:30 in the morning, his door opened. Rose stood in the doorway in her nightgown, shaking, silent tears on her face, the carved horse and the red bandana in her hands. He lifted the blanket without a word. She crossed the room and climbed in and curled against his side, and he put his arm around her and held on while the shaking slowly worked its way through her and eased. "In the dream," she whispered, "they said it was a mistake. They came and said the judge made a mistake and I had to go back." "That is not going to happen," he said. "What the judge ruled today is permanent. It is written into the legal record of this county, and it cannot be undone by anyone. You are my daughter now in every way the law recognizes. And in every way that matters beyond the law. That does not change, not tomorrow, not ever." She was quiet. The shaking continued to ease in stages. "Can you tell me about the dark room?" he asked quietly. "You don't have to, but sometimes saying a thing out loud to someone who is on your side takes some of its power away." A long silence. Then, in a voice barely above breathing, "It was in the basement. No windows, just cold and dark and empty, if you cried too much. If you asked for food when you weren't supposed to, if you tried to run, if you talked back, they put you in there." She paused. "Sometimes for a whole day, sometimes longer." "How long was the longest time?" 3 days, she said. "Because I wouldn't stop looking for my mama. Even after they told me she was dead, I kept thinking maybe she was looking for me. Maybe she didn't know where I was. I kept trying to find a window to look out of." Rage that moved through Garrett was complete and hot, and he kept every trace of it entirely out of his voice. "That was not bad behavior," he said. "That was a little girl who loved her mother. There is nothing wrong with you for that. There has never been anything wrong with you. They said I needed to be tougher. They said the world doesn't care about crying and missing people. They were wrong," he said. "The world they were showing you was not the whole world. It was a very small and very cruel piece of it. And you are out of it. You are not going back to it, and you do not have to be tough all the time anymore. Not here. Here you can be a child, scared, sad, angry, whatever you need to be. I will be tough enough for both of us for as long as you need me to be." She absorbed this in silence then. "What if I'm broken? Miss Hartwell said I was broken." "You are not broken," Garrett said. "You are hurt. Those are different things. Broken things cannot be repaired. Hurt things heal. And you are already healing. I can see it every single day." "How do you know?" "Because you named Bright," he said. "Because you followed me out to the barn. Because you handed me a hammer and let our hands touch and you didn't pull away. Because you walked up to that judge today in front of a room full of strangers and you spoke the truth out loud when it was the hardest possible thing you could have done. That is not broken, Rose. That is the bravest thing I have ever witnessed in my life." She was quiet for a long time. Then very small, almost not a question. "Promise you'll stay?" "I'll always stay," he said. "That is a promise I will never break." She slept. He lay awake in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around them, horses in the barn, wind under the eaves, the slow tick of the house cooling in the October night. He lay awake and felt the weight of what he had become in the space of 3 months and found that it fit him better than anything he had worn in 6 years. Rose learned to read that winter. She learned the way she did everything. Quietly, thoroughly, with a focus so complete it sometimes startled Garrett to look up from his own work and find her bent over a book with the concentrated attention of someone for whom words are not just words, but a territory newly opened and vast and full of things she had not yet gotten to. She talked more. Not easily, not yet, but more questions about the horses and the land and the weather, questions about the books they read together in the evenings, questions about Ruth, which she asked once very carefully and which Garrett answered as honestly as he could, and she listened to his answer with great seriousness, and then nodded once and went back to her book, and he understood that she had needed to know that grief was something that could be survived and had simply been checking. She still had nightmares sometimes. She still occasionally tucked food into her pockets out of old habit that her body remembered even as her mind was working to let it go. Garrett never mentioned either. He simply showed up every morning the same as the morning before and kept his promises and let the days accumulate into something she could put her weight on. That was what healing looked like from the inside, not a single transformation, not a moment when everything changed. Just the slow, stubborn building of days in which the worst thing that happened was a difficult horse or a cold morning or a fence that needed mending. Days in which the food was always there. Days in which the same voice said the same things and meant them. Days in which, gradually, the body began to believe what the mind was carefully, cautiously starting to consider might be true. She was safe. She was going to stay safe. This was home. She was 5 when she laughed for the first time, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, watching Bright chase a barn cat around the corral with the outraged energy of a young horse who has decided that cats are a personal insult. The laugh came out of her before she knew it was coming, and she stopped, startled by the sound of it, and looked at Garrett. He was already laughing. She laughed again. Longer this time. Leaning against the fence rail and laughing at the horse and the cat, and at herself for being surprised that she could do this, that this was something her body still knew how to do. It was, Garrett thought, watching her, the best sound he had ever heard in his life. When Rose was 12, she asked to go back to Harlan's Crossing, not to the facility that had been shut down permanently in the winter following the hearing. Director Baines had been charged and convicted alongside 2 senior staff members. The children remaining in the facility had been redistributed to homes that had been properly and thoroughly reviewed, a process Judge Aldrich had overseen personally, with the focused attention of a man who intends to sleep at night. Rose wanted to go to the town square, to the spot where the platform had stood. They rode out on a morning in early spring, just the 2 of them before Hattie was up, in the new quiet green of a Wyoming morning after a long winter. The town had changed in 8 years, the way towns do, incrementally and without ceremony. The platform was entirely gone. The square had been replanted, benches installed, flower boxes along the front of the general store, a small garden in the center where the auction platform had stood. Rose stood on the exact spot. She was 12 years old and tall for it, her hair properly blonde in the morning light, her posture straight and unguarded and entirely her own. She looked nothing like the child who had stood here 8 years ago. She looked like someone who had done the long, hard work of becoming herself and had arrived. "I remember not being able to cry," she said, looking at the flower boxes, at the benches, at the ordinary morning life of a small town going about its business around them. "I had stopped being able to cry by then. I had been here twice before and nobody wanted me, and I thought, this is just what I am. Something that keeps getting brought here and left." Garrett stood beside her. "I didn't even look up when I heard your voice," she said. "I heard you say hold that and I didn't look. I thought it had nothing to do with me. Things that happened in this square never had anything to do with me in a good way." "You still hadn't looked at me when I paid," Garrett said, "or when I signed the papers, or when I lifted you off the platform. I didn't know if you were safe. That was a reasonable thing not to know." She said, then quieter, "But something happened when you spoke. Something so small I can't even describe it properly. Like one wall out of all the walls I had built went down just a fraction, just enough to let in the idea that something might be different this time. She paused. I didn't trust it, I didn't believe it, but I heard it. She turned to look at him. 12 years old, with the kind of steadiness in her eyes that only comes to people who have been afraid of everything and kept going anyway. You saw me, she said. That is the whole of it. When every single person in that square looked at me and saw a problem, saw something defective and expensive and not worth the trouble, you looked and you saw a person. I do not know how to explain what that meant. I'm not sure any words I have are large enough for it. Garrett put his arm around her shoulders. You were always a person, Rose, he said. You were a person before I ever laid eyes on you. I just gave you enough time and enough safety for the rest of the world to have to reckon with that fact. She leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him since she was 4 years old and had decided, in the slow and careful and hard-won way of children who have been taught not to decide such things, that he was safe. I'm going to spend my life making sure other children get what you gave me, she said. I'm going to make sure that what happened to me, to all those children, cannot keep happening the way it did. I'm going to change things. I know you will. I learned it from you, that one person making one choice can change the shape of a life. You learned it from yourself, he said. I just made it possible for you to learn it. They stood together on the spot where everything had changed, in the early spring morning, while the town of Harlan's Crossing went about its ordinary business around them, and the flower boxes bloomed along the front of the general store, and somewhere down the street a horse was being watered, and the world continued, the way the world always continues, and two people stood at the center of a private history and let it settle into something that felt, finally and permanently, like peace. Director Baines was convicted and sentenced. The facility was shut and its doors sealed. The remaining children were placed through a new process that Judge Aldrich designed himself, thorough, careful, centered on the well-being of the child rather than the convenience of the county. Miss Hartwell was suspended pending review. She did not return to her position. The 3 families who had come to the hearing went quietly home. Some of them, in the years that followed, opened their homes to children of their own through the new placement process, and a few of them did it well, and that was something. Cole Ranch did not become an institution. Garrett Cole was not a reformer by temperament or ambition. He was a rancher who had made one choice on one Tuesday morning and had spent the years since living out the consequences of that choice as honestly and thoroughly as he could. But word traveled. It traveled the way word travels about things that are quietly extraordinary, slowly and then all at once. Spreading through the networks of doctors and lawyers and judges and social workers who dealt with the problem of children that the system had given up on. People began to appear at the ranch, not to stay, but to ask questions, to understand how Garrett had done what he had done with Rose, to try to learn something they could take back with them and apply. He told them the same thing every time. You give them time. You give them safety with no conditions on it. You show up the same way every single day. You do not rush them or demand things from them or make the healing conditional on meeting any timeline other than their own. You keep your promises. Every single one. No exceptions. That was all he knew. That was what had worked. It was, he had come to understand, both simpler and harder than anything else he had ever done. On a warm evening decades later, Garrett Cole sat on the front porch of Cole Ranch and watched the sun go down over his land for what felt like the 10,000th time. And for the 10,000th time, it was different from every time before. He was old. His hair had been white for years. His hands ached and cold, whether in a way they had not when he was young, and the work of the ranch was managed now mostly by other people while he supervised and advised and occasionally got in the way out of sheer habit. He had made his peace with all of that. Rose was inside. She had come back from the capital 3 days ago. She was a lawyer now, had been for years, and she argued cases in courts that mattered, cases that had changed laws and shifted systems and made the world, in specific and measurable ways, less cruel to children than it had been before she started. She had written a book. She had testified before the state legislature 4 times. She was known, in the circles where such things were known, as someone you did not want on the opposing side of an argument about the welfare of children, because she was relentless and precise, and she had the particular authority of someone who was not speaking in theory. She was inside arguing with Hattie about something. That was how you knew they were happy with each other. Bright had lived a long and good life and was buried under the oak tree at the far edge of the property, next to a stone that Rose had chosen herself. Hattie, as Garrett had always suspected she would, seemed to be outliving everyone. He sat on the porch in the evening light and thought about a Tuesday morning in August of 1889, about a crowd that had laughed at a child and decided she was worth nothing, about the specific feeling of standing at the edge of that crowd and knowing, with the absolute, unargued certainty of something understood below the level of thought, that they were wrong. He thought about 3 hours on an open road with a child who would not look at him, and would not drink the water he had placed beside her, and weighed less in his arms than a bale of hay, and went rigid at his touch. He thought about 5 small fingers against his palm for 3 seconds on a Thursday afternoon in October. He thought about a voice in a stone courthouse, barely a whisper, carrying to every corner of a silent room. He had stayed, he was still here. He thought about all the years between that courthouse and this porch, and he did not think of them as sacrifice or hardship or the cost of a choice made on an impulse. He thought of them as his life. His actual life. The one that had been waiting for him on the other side of the walls he had built, patient and real and full of things he had not known he was still capable of. Love. Purpose. The specific daily joy of being needed by someone who had learned, against all evidence and at great personal cost, to need you. The sound of voices inside Rose and Hattie, laughing now about whatever they had been arguing about, came through the open window and out into the evening air. Garrett Cole sat on his porch and listened to his family and watched the sun go down over his land. Some things you do because they are right. Some things you do because you have no other choice. And some things, the things that remake you from the inside, the things that show you who you actually are underneath all the walls and the silence and the careful self-sufficient distance, you do because a child looks at you from a platform in a summer square and does not look at you, has learned not to look, has learned not to hope, and something cracks open in you that you thought was sealed forever, and you find that it was not sealed at all. It was just waiting for the right reason to open. Garrett Cole had found his reason on a Tuesday morning. He had never, for a single day, regretted what he did with it.